It's a mobile and digital museum that is all about encouraging conversation about the climate and ecological emergency. So it's called Climate Museum UK, but then each of those words, Climate Museum and UK, has to be expanded. So not just climate, but the wider Earth crisis, not just a museum, or it uses the idea of museum because we use objects and we are collecting as well. We're collecting people's response to the planet's emergency, but it's museum in a very loose sense. We also want to stir an emotional response to help people to process the unconscious or conscious trauma of living through extremely uncertain times and material distress as well, increasingly. We are collecting whatever it is that people are expressing, but we're also collecting protest ephemera and artist books and book publications, and we want to create capacity and resources for artists all over the UK, artists, communicators, creative educators, to create their own museum resources. You know, maybe they might create a mini museum in their house or their school or their studio using our principles. We are resistant to communicating in the one-to-many model. So we're not doing science communication. We're not taking the best research and expertise and mediating it and making it accessible to the public. It's more democratic. It's much more about everybody who comes into a room being seen as equal and having acquired expertise and coming together to communicate together how the questions they have, the feelings they have, the actions they want to take. It's hermeneutic, you know, they discover together shared understanding of the emergency. So one of the principles is about being positopian, which is this idea of overcoming the fight between optimists and pessimists, and people getting very fixed in either very utopian views of the future or very doomy views of the future. Whereas a positopian view is where you practice imagining many, many scenarios and you try to braid or weave a path of possible, thrivable ways of being. And so the braiding is like a challenge of extreme reach and extreme imagination. I'm more interested in artists or creative educators and their process, you know, how they interact with people, contexts, and materials and ideas rather than objects. You know, we're not collecting art. We're not aiming to create a beautiful gallery of beautiful climate art. Art for me is a very demotic thing. It's actually how all people practice living in a complex world, but artists and creative educators have more meta-awareness of that, or more practice. One thing that's been working really well recently is a suitcase of objects, and they're objects that I just collected around the house or around, you know, from junk markets. They're things like a little temperature gauge, a little solar light, a toy, an hourglass, you know, a sand, an old snowman candle. They're not precious things, they're just objects for talking with. And all the objects are in cloth bags. When we run workshops, we might put a little selection of objects on a table. There are lots of tables of people. And then we give a series of prompts for them to play with the activities, to interpret them, to write labels, to maybe select just one, maybe then to pass an object to another table, then to make their own objects with clay. So the idea is that in a pop-up Climate Museum, you might have an unfolding art display of people's climate emotions. Hopefully as well, you would have a mini museum of objects being built up as well. So yeah, we're basically trying to create climate museums everywhere. At the beginning, you asked me what was important for me to communicate, and I talked about climate emotions, but I didn't really talk about sort of the ethics and how important it is to enrich the registers of communication around climate and ecology. So we very much want to broaden the discussion to be less about the technical, plastic cups and driving and reducing emissions, not because that's not important, but because it's so well covered by other organisations. And we're really trying to focus on understanding the experience of living in a planetary emergency. We're all in some ways on the front line. We're all connected with people who are more directly on the front line, rather than a sort of them and us. The justice issues are things that affect all of us.